Good evening. Welcome. On behalf of my colleagues at the South Asia Center, it is my pleasure to offer welcome remarks on this event. My name is Irfan Nooruddin. I'm the Senior Director of the South Asia Center and Professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. There's many things that are going to be discussed over this week, and I'm sure many of you are coming from a meeting and will be headed to another. But possibly a common theme is going to be how the future of the global economy is fundamentally digital. And the digital-first nature of the future of the global economy raises for us a set of governance questions that I think it behooves us to sort of tackle and grapple with the implications of all the changes that are going to occur. So at the same time that we are super excited about the technological transformation of the development space and the opportunities that new technologies create to bring millions of our fellow planetary citizens out of poverty, we should also recognize that all technological innovation brings with it distributional consequences. Some people benefit more than others, and indeed, at any given moment in time, some people lose. So in the context of a digital-first economy, the questions that beg answering include who will own all of this data? What is the relative power between governments, the private sector, and citizens? Is the word public a synonym for state-run? And if we don't want a state-run digital economy, how do we think about the right balance of power, if you would, between the public and private as we build this new future that is technology forward and digital first? To answer these questions, we have put together a really amazing panel of experts coming at this perspective from the public, from the private, from the multilateral, from the think tank and intellectual space, to have a conversation with my colleague, Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the GeoEconomic Center, which is our partner in this conversation. We also wish to acknowledge the partnership of the MasterCard Policy Center for the Digital Economy in making today possible. These are big questions. They're going to require lots of us grappling with these questions simultaneously, and we're very, very excited and grateful to all of you for joining us here today. We'll start with a public conversation, and then we look forward to engaging the group in person here at the Atlantic Council in tackling some of the thornier, more complicated questions that arise from the remarks that our colleagues make over the next half an hour. To introduce them, I turn this over now to Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the GeoEconomic Center. Josh?
Irfan, thank you so much, and I want to thank you and all our colleagues at the South Asia Center for the collaboration across IMF-World Bank Week, but really the entire work we do together over the course of the year. It's one of the best partnerships we have at the Atlantic Council. I'm very excited to welcome this distinguished panel. We have with us Arturo Herrera. Arturo is the Global Director of Governance at the World Bank, and of course, the former Finance Minister in Mexico, where we got to work together in a previous capacity. Tim Murphy, Chief Administrative Officer of MasterCard, and Priya, Vora, Managing Director, Digital Impact Alliance. Arturo, Tim, Priya, thanks for being here. Thanks for engaging in this conversation. We're going to have a lively, dynamic, agree, disagree. We'll see how it goes. And we want audience questions as well, so please submit them for those watching online using the hashtag #FutureOfEcon. But Arturo, I'm going to defer to you. It is World Bank IMF Week. You're here from the World Bank. And the first question is really, where does the World Bank come at these issues? Different countries are moving at different speeds. We learned a lot through the pandemic. Some countries are really making digital public infrastructure a focus. Others are doing it more ad hoc. What is your role at the bank, and what is the bank's role in encouraging countries to move faster on this area?
So we have a long journey on these issues, which I was remembering, I would say, in a rather funny way, a few months ago when I came back to the World Bank. So I have been coming back and forth from the World Bank twice, from the government each time. And when I came back in July, I had to put in order my documents in Mexico, and I had to actually, for my house there, to change the name of the contract on the water services to my name, right? So I went there, and they told me, actually, you need to bring the title of the property. So I went back, came with copies of the title, and then they told me, well, it's the whole title, which is like 100 pages. It's just not the front page. So I went back, and then that house is co-owned by my wife, and say, well, you actually have to bring your wife's signature in a letter allowing you to put your name on the contract. To make a long story short, I was unsuccessful to do it. I have to send someone. But the point is, when I started thinking about it later, say, Well, the title is issued by the public registry, which is also an official entity of Mexico City government. So they shouldn't have asked me to do it if they have it in a digital way. They should have been able to consult it immediately, and we could have sold that probably online and without me being there. And that's where we are in terms of which kind of these projects that we have are actually able to set up in a way that serve directly the citizens. But that's not where we are coming from. So I would say 20-something years ago, 30 years ago, the governments were, and many of our projects, were directed in terms of how to make easier the life of the government. Is how do we put in a digital platform the budget, the accounting, then the payments. The second generation, it was about the payments rather than paying checks or rather than paying cash. And I actually witnessed the last generation of public services that were paying cash in an envelope. It was very expensive, by the way. People have the idea that there's nothing cheaper than cash, but actually you have to hire a company that brings in armored cars to that, right? So we start by making the life of the governments easier, and what we are doing now is making the lives of the citizens easier in our projects. Now, there are two big changes on this one. One is technology by itself, which has been improving. The other one was COVID. COVID was a tragedy, but there are very few good things coming out of COVID. One is move the digital economy in a leapfrog change, and also help everybody, government, citizens, etc., to move to a digital mind framework.
That's very helpful, and I'm glad you brought up the point, of what we've learned from COVID, and what then we have to sort of internalize from our perspective, what works and what doesn't work. And so, Tim, it's a natural transition to you there because you're doing this. MasterCard's doing this, the private sector is doing this, and you're working with institutions like the bank and working with governments. But what are you seeing? What's working? What's not working?
Josh, so first to say, terrific to be here, and this is an outstanding panel. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Look, here's what I would say. I think if you look back at the last 30 years of digital transformation, it has been unpredictable to say who has succeeded and who has suffered. You might say that large institutions are better able to address these issues, and that's true. And yet for so many companies, including my own, the digital transformation has been about both opportunity and challenge, and how do you make sure you're staying ahead of the latest technologies and the latest developments. And similarly, I think for governments, some governments have embraced this transformation very well and are using it to leapfrog tech and delivering better services. Others, I think, are struggling. As you look forward, I think we're seeing three things. One is to say, the next billion consumers that we've been talking about bringing onto the financial mainstream and into digital platforms, they are here today, and they will now have very significant impacts on government and on commerce. We've seen 3 times growth in the last 5 years in terms of how Indian consumers are consuming digital goods. They now exceed Americans' use of, and that is gigabytes per month, and that is for an economy that is, on a GDP basis, so much smaller per capita. That's extraordinary. So we all have to work with an increasingly digitized consumer base now. Second, we're seeing dramatic, we should talk about this today, dramatic acceleration in technologies that really will be a challenge for all of us. And I think anyone who tells you they've got the answers on how to navigate generative AI and so on is selling something, and that really needs our careful attention. And then the last thing I would say is we need to be very careful and thoughtful about the kind of world we're creating in terms of digital fragmentation. I think it's different than decoupling, but the reality is there are enormous forces in the world today that are fragmenting this digital infrastructure. Many of the reasons and the rationale for that are perfectly understandable, and yet the consequences could be severe. We worry a lot about that as a private sector player, and how can we have a constructive role in encouraging a more connected digital future is something we worry a lot about.
That's really helpful on fragmentation because we think a lot about international standards.
Right.
And of course, the World Bank's here, and we do a lot on central bank digital currency that we can talk about. But this fragmentation, splintering different systems without a sort of regulatory umbrella, not to stifle innovation, but to have some basic agreed to rules of the road is incredibly important. I'm also glad you mentioned AI. We had Spain's finance minister, Nadia Calviño, here, and she flagged that specific issue this morning on needing some sort of US-European conversation on AI. So we'll get into both of that. Priya, I want to turn to you. We're talking about the positive sides. We're talking about everything tech can bring, and we'll talk more about it. But there's a downside here too, and part of that is that not everyone always benefits from innovation equally. And I wonder your perspective on this as we roll out these new technologies, ensuring that people across all spectrums of the income ladder are actually benefiting from them.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. I couldn't agree more that the last few years have just seen this massive acceleration of digitization, but simultaneously we've seen the exacerbation and certainly exposed digital inequities. 40% of the world still is offline. Many more are less meaningfully connected than you and I are, so not able to access the world's online tools and information. And that's only compounding, depending on many of the choices that we collectively make in the next several years. So exclusion is a huge worry of ours. So too is concentration of power. We see it in the public sector, also the private sector. There's kind of a reinforcing cycle of data capture means more data capture, so it's kind of self-fulfilling in that way, and economic monopolies can soon become political monopolies. So I think that's a real danger to be paying attention to. And then the third is really in this broad category of data misuse, data abuse. I mean, there's a range of issues in here, and AI is only going to put all of this on steroids, technically speaking. But so as I think about governance in the digital age, I think we have to be setting our minds on what's going to drive inclusion, what's going to drive healthy competitive markets, and what's going to foster and maintain trust.
And Arturo, to that point, what are you seeing that works? And when you talk to countries about this from your role at the World Bank, how often is the privacy conversation happening? How often is a cybersecurity conversation, a data protection and ownership conversation happening, in addition to all the benefits countries are thinking about as they roll out these programs?
Well, it happens all the time, right? And it happens, I would say, with understanding in two different ways some of these issues. For example, the issue of trust is really important when we talk about these things. But sometimes we use trust in two different meanings. One is trusting the digital world, right? And as it happened in the example, I'll just, the story I told you, the public officer on the other side didn't trust a digital document. She wanted to see an actual hard copy, right? Now, in terms of the technology now, the digital identifications are more trustable, are better, are more secure than actually a hard copy. So that's part of the conversation. The other one is the trust in the government or whoever is the one who gets this information, trusting that it's going to be properly used, that it's not going to be misused. And that means that the projects that we have require a different kind of element than in the past. It's not only a technical solution, but it actually requires an engagement strategy with the citizens. It's not sufficient to bring what's the best solution. It's important to explain them why that solution is good for them and why it's a project that kind of take care of the issues that they may be concerned.
Yeah, I think the way you broke out the two parts of trust is so key, and the government component of this. We see this in the work we do on digital assets. It's one thing for a bank to might potentially know how I'm spending my money, or to know how I'm spending my money if they have legal authorization, and people feel very different about a central bank, potentially. So that trust and the government trust versus the private sector is a key element of this. But Tim, back to you on that. because you work with governments every day. You have to do this in a regulatory framework. I'm sure sometimes it's more clear and sometimes it's less clear what the opportunities are. But what does this public-private sector partnership look like if it's being effective?
I think the first thing I would say is that we should recognize that most of the digital platform solutions from the very beginning have been a form of public-private partnership. I mean, identity, which is critical to so many of these things, is fundamentally a public good that is created by a government and so on. And so I think the future needs to be how, as technology evolves, do we continue to advance a public-private conversation so that we have, and particularly in payments, let me say it this way, I think we need to advance the conversation about what should be public infrastructure in payment systems, which is my business, and on the other hand, do you want entirely public infrastructure that crowds out private sector? Not surprisingly, I have a view on that, but we should debate those things. There needs to be a rich conversation across a range of the attributes of the digital future about what's appropriate for the public sector and what's appropriate for the private sector. Each brings value, but I think a balanced solution that involves contributions from both makes enormous sense. A little bit what we're seeing today when we talk about digital public infrastructure, I would almost characterize it in the following way. There has been a natural reaction to a US-driven, let's say, laissez-faire model with a lot of private sector innovations that, let's say, have externalized costs. You were talking about that. If the alternative is an entirely public sector solution, I can assure you there will be the inverse, some form of an inverse model where there will be benefits and costs. Isn't the right answer somewhere in the middle? And I think that's what we try to advance in our conversations with governments. We've always relied on public infrastructure for portions of our services. There's things that are best in the public sector, but there's things we can do better as well. And trying to advance the conversation about where private can make a constructive contribution in the context of a regulated market is something that's just critical to our future.
And when we think about the delineation there, it makes sense to me on payments. You know, there's rails, a lot of those are public. We're talking about FedNow in the US.
Sure.
Then there's currency, which of course the central banks issue. But I think it gets a little more murky when you're thinking about issues like AI. Where is government's role in that versus private sector innovation? That does not, at least to me, and Priya, tell me if you disagree, like have a clear delineation on some of these other potentially public digital infrastructure issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real discussion around digital public infrastructure going on right now, and I do think the danger is that it's being defined as, you know, three things: identity, payments, and data exchange.
Right.
And
Yeah.
for whatever reason, the broader ethos is not yet appreciated, which is when digitization has just as likely kind of negative outcomes as positive outcomes, and probably the truth is both simultaneously. What is the role of the public sector to drive inclusion, trust, and competitive markets? And it's going to be different for different, as technology evolves, it's going to be different in different contexts, depending on market players and appetite, and what is really the addressable market. So, you know, I think the ethos of this discussion around digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, is just to recognize that the public sector can't just sit back anymore.
Yeah.
You know, the days of hailing the internet as the all-democratizing force is behind us, and now there needs to be a real role for the government. You know, we think about very practical and kind of mundane things. How do you create a data protection authority with budget and staffing independence from the administration? How do you create redressal systems that are responsive, especially when you have a judicial system that's very slow? How might you put online dispute resolution baked into your technology layers, those kinds of things? But I agree, it gets a lot more complicated, and we're kind of at the dawn of the consumer AI era. It's just going to get a lot more complicated.
No, I like the specific things you brought out there on the data protection authorities. And I mean, this is the conversation we need to be having about what's next. And Arturo, is the bank, is this sort of a reactive from the banks or a proactive or both? Meaning, like, are countries coming to you and asking for help in this and then the bank's providing support? Or is it the bank going and saying there needs to be more, to Tim's point, about international coordination on these issues?
No, I think for a long time we have been advocating adopting some of these instruments to advance the development agenda, right? And we operate in different ways. It could be strictly with the government, like I said, their back office. It could be on education, health, etc. We also recognize, and it was briefly mentioned by Priya, that there are some other aspects, for example, aspects of fairness. And again, there are two ways in which the fairness concept could come. One, which is pretty close to us, and it was particularly relevant in the early days of the digitalization, which was not everybody had an access to a laptop, right? Mm-hmm. So it was the digital divide, which is the way we used to call it at the World Bank, was actually increasing inequalities in a world. Now we are seeing things like, for example, as we are moving to what we call mobile government. Yes, still not everybody has a laptop, but most people. Now there are more smartphones in the world than citizens. I have a couple, so I don't think that means that there's one for each people. But that requires less, and it helps to bring certain services to the less well-off than in the initial stages. But there's another aspect of fairness, which to a large extent, and the World Bank was involved on that, was addressed almost 2 years ago. And that's what I meant when you refer to that. One of the great aspects of the digital economy is that it has huge economies of scale. Mm. But huge economies of scale means that certain activities can get concentrated in very few actors. And if one goes back, let's say, 30 years ago and look which were the main companies in the New York Stock Exchange, it was probably industrial companies, companies like Ford, General Electric, etc. If we go back probably 15 years ago, there were very large financial institutions. Last time I checked it, which was around a year ago, it was Meta, Google, Microsoft, etc. Right? But these sectors bring also, which is great, but it's also really tricky. When one buys if people still buy physical newspapers around the corner, it's very easy to understand where they have to pay the taxes. They have to pay the taxes to the city of DC. If they read the same paper in an iPad, it's not clear where they are gonna pay the taxes. So the issue of fairness and taxation is huge, because these are the largest companies, and they were not necessarily paying taxes. So these are some of the issues that we are concerned about.
Well, not only are they not paying taxes, there's, at least in the countries where we're working, there's a real sense of data colonialization, right? You know, Google.
Explain that a little more.
Well, that big American tech companies are gleaning data insights and not to our benefit. And so there's a real knee-jerk reaction towards data localization, or somehow hoarding data as a strategic asset.
Yeah.
And I think you can debate the logic of it, but it's in essence the sense of fairness. Who's gaining in the data economy?
Well, Tim, so back to you then. What is the sort of corporate responsibility here as these digital infrastructures, I won't say public, but digital public-private infrastructures get built, and there are much more information that a company like MasterCard has than they ever had before? How do you think about that?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's something we think long and hard about. At the end of the day, our view is we have a fundamental obligation around security, and we need to be investing to the highest global standards around cybersecurity. We need to be laser focused on highest global standards on privacy, which is why we've, for example, enabled GDPR-like compliance around the world, even though it's not required. And we think, because we think it's the right thing for our business, that we need really strong data governance protections that limits data and that fundamentally adopts a posture where human beings should control the data and benefit from it. And I think a digital economy that is more people-centric around data controls, whether that's and being able to monetize their own data, is a critical step that the world economy has to take. But let me say this, I am very concerned, I'll go back to my fragmentation comment, that the global agenda around addressing some of these issues is weaker than it should be. There should be more work on a digital trade agenda that addresses some of the equity issues, Priya, that you've been talking about, but that also protects us from the worst aspects of fragmentation, which is data localization that doesn't let you look at patterns across data sets that could create more value or a more secure ecosystem. If you talk about to cyber experts today about why are we not doing more to create norms of behavior in cyberspace, at least across like-minded companies or countries or large groupings of them to help create a more secure ecosystem, that agenda is weak. It's not where it needs to be. And so this evidence of fragmentation is real. It's showing up in real policy issues around cross-border data, around digital trade, cross-border data, and cyber. And I think my call to action and what we are constantly saying, not just to our US government partners, but to government in other places, is how can we play a constructive role to help lead on these issues? We need more public goods in these spaces.
Well, let me ask you on that, and then anyone feel free to respond. Whose responsibility is that? Meaning, is the US doing enough? We can say there needs to be more global standards, there needs to be more global cooperation, but I see a lot happening out of Europe in this space.
Very much
and
so.
from my perspective, but tell me if anyone here disagrees, I see less happening from the US side.
Totally agree. Europe is leading the way on regulating the future digital economy. Interestingly enough, in the context of a lot of that innovation is not coming from Europe, it's coming from the United States. And so perhaps that is overly simplistic, but not broadly wrong. And so I think your conversation about a transatlantic there's something, there is something there. But I'm generally, candidly disappointed in US leadership on some of these issues, and we hope to see more.
No, I appreciate you being candid there, and it's something we try to drive here at the Council on, especially on digital currency issues, but it's a broader issue about the innovations and the tech can come from the US, but then the standards are getting set elsewhere. So reactions to that from your perspective, Priya?
Yeah, there's so much to say. I mean, I couldn't agree with Tim more that the whole next wave of innovation should really be about giving more tools of transparency and control to people.
Yep.
And in a world where there's a lot of mistrust, and for good reason, in institutions, whether that's public sector or private sector, giving people more control is only the right thing. I mean, and the only alternative. And I too am disappointed that the US government hasn't come in a bigger way. I mean, what we hear time and time again is the US is seen as an anti-China, taking an anti-China position, but not sure what the positive vision and standard setting, is that they're trying to take. And I think this is one that speaks to the economic sensibilities of Africa. Yeah. Instead of just having a rip and replace policy, get rid of your 2G Huawei equipment, take a positive posture around creating the infrastructure for data mobility, for using data for economic and social gains. That would just be something that could really work for the democratic principles that the US wants to stand behind, but also really speak to the economic imperative across Africa. And I think it's a win-win.
So Arturo, your reaction to Priya's point, win-win, but does the fragmentation that Tim brought up prevent some of that from happening in practice? Because the ideas are out there, the tech's out there, the interest and demand is out there, but then when you try to put it into practice, you run into, well, you can't use this system or you can't use this system. Does that play out in your daily experience at the bank?
Well, yes, and it's pretty close to the issue related to regulation that you mentioned. And I'm as opposed to Tim, I'm a little bit less surprised that regulation is lagging, because that's the nature of regulation. Usually something happens, the government find out, and I'm talking anywhere, it could be energy, electricity, telecommunications, currency, find out that there are some issues that need to be polished, and then regulation is implemented and is catching up. which, by the way, brings me to one issue that you just mentioned, and it's a little more related to my previous professional life than my current responsibility. But it's quite interesting because it highlights one very specific issue about regulation, and it's the regulation of cryptocurrencies, right? And finance authorities and central bank authorities have been a little bit reluctant to regulate it for a completely different reason than the one we imagine. It's not that they are just one step behind. Is that by regulating it, you're basically assuming that it's an okay activity, right? And that's where the public sector is debating, because the two main uses so currency have certain properties, including keeping the value safe, and that's clearly not happening. The value of some of the cryptocurrencies is much more volatile than any activity, and there are two uses from which the demand of this kind of assets has coming is either for pure speculation or for illegal transactions. So that's when I could see how authorities may refuse to give steps toward regulation, because it's like de facto assuming that it's okay.
Well, Tim, I have to turn to you on the crypto question, just from your perspective, somewhat related to this conversation and broadly, working in the space you do. But I think there's a trust element when we think about this, because people see what happens in crypto. Some people have lost money in crypto, and then that can undercut the broader digital transformation, digital agenda. We see this in polling. When one thing happens in one sector, it can sort of taint innovations in payments or innovations in delivery of services from public or private and other sectors.
Yes, it's a complicated topic. Look, I think to the extent crypto is clearly a speculative asset class and I think should be regulated as such, our view is that it becomes, first of all, let's set aside the products that are in market today with some of the underlying technology. The underlying technology is enormously powerful, and I think will ultimately be a transformational force in the world. But look, for cryptocurrencies to have to be good for consumer retail payments, and it's an open question given the other technologies that exist in the world today, including many driven by governments and real-time payments and so on, whether that's actually needed, but let's assume that it is for purposes of your answer, then it simply must have appropriate oversight and regulation, which is lacking today. And that can either happen through a central bank delivered currency, a CBDC, which again, back to this conversation about what's public and what's private, I would hope was not the monster that destroyed the fractional reserve banking system, which has served, I think, the world broadly well since the 14th century or earlier.
I didn't think we'd go 14th century.
I went 14th century, and so again, but that is a debate. Or through well-regulated stable coins that assure consumers, strong consumer protections must be at the core of these things. If we get that, I actually think you can see further development of this technology as a consumer payment, but absent that, it's going to continue to struggle, as well it should.
Yeah. And I have to just put a plug in here for the Central Bank Digital Currency Tracker we run at the Council, because we're mapping what's happening all over the world. There's over 100 countries pursuing CBDC, and you can look at all the different technological developments they have. And of course, almost all of them are intermediated through. So there's a kind of sometimes a misnomer about CBDC that you're going to open up your phone and have a Fed app. The Fed's not going to do that, nor is any other country in the world going to do that. So the nuance there is important. But I want to turn, we have about 10 minutes left, to some of the audience questions we're getting in. So Priya, this is kind of interesting. We're talking about digital public infrastructure a little bit as an ends to itself and the benefits and the problems. But the question here is about achieving other goals, specifically climate change. How can digital public infrastructure be used to achieve policy goals that are not related to tech, but can be a way government sort of, does what it's trying to do better?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of political imperatives. Climate action is top among those for so many countries, as it should be. And I think when it comes to digital, Arturo, you said that there's economies of scale in digital. And I think the really interesting question is, take any given use case, whether it's you want to get messages to farmers for whatever purposes, or make payments to healthcare workers, or to track your grid for more efficient energy usage and distribution, so on and so forth. What's fascinating about the digital space is there are a lot of these building block digital public goods out there. These are kind of digital tools that you can stack up like Lego blocks and use for different purposes. And I think what we're trying to do as Dial is help countries, almost inventory what digital public goods are in place. You might have stacked it up in this way for farmer messaging, but you can kind of reconfigure, add in a few more tools, a few more protocols, and you can now use this case. So there's real economies of scale if you can support a government in this kind of agile digital stack design. That's the best analogy I can give it. But then you take something like climate action and certain very discrete activities you want to do, rather than configuring this massive technology solution from start to end, which can kind of take you down the healthcare.gov route. There's a whole design process that allows you to think about, well, what do we have in place? How do we reuse it? How do you try to more lightly introduce certain protocols and kind of get on with it a little more nimbly?
I was at the White House when healthcare.gov rolled out, so that was a little traumatic for me. But thank you for bringing that up for all of us. Arturo, question for you here, and I'll kind of weave this a little differently, but really a question about the internal workings of the bank in terms of how this is prioritized within the bank, how you work with other parts of the bank, how what you're doing and the history of this role, which I'm not sure how long it's existed, fits into the broader mission of the bank.
So this is really a critical question, and the bank is the first time I joined the bank a few years ago, 12 years ago. I found a really fascinating institution, but incredibly complex, right? Even the organization is really complex. So you have we call it a matrix, but it's really 3 dimensions. So you have topical issues, and then you have organized by regions. Yeah. But then you actually have global experts on this aspect. So as you may imagine, in an organization that is that big, and we have a very large footprint, more than 100, more than 140 countries, we actually have staff there, right? So how do you align what we do? And we have to align it around certain principles. Yeah. So we have currently 2 main principles, and we are in the process of adding a few more. The main principle is to eliminate extreme poverty by year 2030. The second one is what we call shared prosperity, which is really an euphemism to say that we want a fairer society where income and wealth distribution are very distributed. Now we are bringing the issue of climate change to these aspects, and the issue of resilience, because we, after going through COVID, the war in Ukraine, food crisis, raising interest rates, environment, pressure on the debt side, so countries need to start preparing for what is next, because apparently there's something next around the corner. So then when we look to our projects, it could be digital or whatever, they have to fit into these objectives. That our projects we need to make sure that they have an impact in reducing extreme poverty, that they have an impact in building more inclusive societies.
Are there metrics you're looking at from the bank perspective to measure this by country or in the aggregate? Well,
by project, actually.
Yeah.
So each project has to state how they are going to impact, and they have to have expected impacts, and then we are evaluated. It's not necessarily fun, but we have an independent evaluation group which comes and randomly pick up some projects and make a thorough evaluation.
There's governance external, and then there's governance internal. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so this is the question I wanted to end with to each of you, and I'll go in reverse order that I went in the opening round. And really, it's about the 5 years forward question, which is, Tim, you brought up fragmentation. So what does this look like 5 years from now? We'll be back at the IMF-World Bank meetings. I want you all to come back here to the council. Have we done this right, and what would that look like? for different economies around the world? What does this sort of international standard setting or regulation around that look like? Or the downside, what does this look like if we get this wrong? And Priya, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we can all paint the picture of utopia and dystopia. You know, everyone's included and they're accessing tools and, you know, on their merry way. You know, I think if I were to put my bets on it, here we are 7 years out from the SDGs. I mean, you just named off all the crises and kind of persistent challenges that we're facing as a world. And I fear that our multilateral institutions and frankly, US government, you know, a lot of the organizations that have led the world through very tough times may not be acting with enough urgency. So, you know, it's certainly my hope that this week, you know, people are gathering sometimes for the first time since the pandemic or since the war and since the, you know, inflation has just gone gangbusters, and there's a real sense of urgency and desire to invest differently, to partner differently, to operate with, you know, some gumption. That's my hope.
No, I really appreciate you saying gumption and urgency. It came up in the conversation this morning, and some of that's been lacking, frankly, and I hope that carries through this week, as you said. Tim?
I would endorse what Priya said 100%. I think, you know, again, not to go back to purely to the fragmentation issue. I fear 5 to 7 years from now we will have a more fragmented world on these issues that is less wealthy and with less prospects for growth than it otherwise would be. And I think that is my main concern. On the other hand, there are vast reasons to be optimistic. I do think that there is an interplay, it's already been mentioned, between the power of the digital transformation and the ability to give individuals control of their own data, control of their own autonomy, the chance to make the right their choices, but choices that contribute to some of the major world problems like climate change, is vast. And we already know. I mean, let's celebrate that the world has been through. It's struggling at the moment, but has been through a dramatic transformation in wealth and inclusion from a whole variety of reasons, including digital public infrastructure. We can see the positive upside is we can see another billion people included over that period. We're committed to that. I know others are as well, and that can unleash vast potential. So it's always going to be it could go one way or another. It'll probably be a little bit of both, and that will be fascinating to live through.
Yeah, and there will be winners and losers in that as well. Arturo.
So one of the challenging issues that we are facing is that with all these crises piling up on top of each other, it's very tempting to focusing on the emergency flavor of the month, and keep track and lose track of the medium-term perspective. But we are trying not to do that, right? So one thing that we are doing actually in my team is we for the second time we release what we call a GovTech Maturity Index, and it's pretty revealing in certain sense because we are catching up with technology and we see all the progress, but if we don't stop to take a look at it, we don't realize that progress has been uneven. And there has been, as an example I said again, much more progress in the back office of the governments than, let's say, in using digital media to listen and interact with the citizens. So in 5 years, we hope that we have crossed that bridge, and there's a closer interaction between governments and citizens. And also, as again in the example I provided, there's a much better use of the interoperability of the different databases that are in the different agencies.
I really hope you're right on that interoperability point. It's something which animates a lot of our work at the Council, and we will all come back here before 5 years to evaluate progress or lack thereof Arturo, Tim, Priya, thank you. Thank you for doing this.
you.
I know how
Josh,
busy
thank
this
you.
week is for everyone. Thank you all for joining us, watching all around the world. We are doing a series of events during IMF World Bank Week, hosting a distinguished group of finance ministers and central bankers. You can find the full lineup on our website. I want to thank our colleagues at the South Asia Center. On behalf of the GeoEconomic Center and the entire Atlantic Council, thank you for being with us. Have a great rest of your day.